Good morning, everybody. It's great to see you this morning. We're glad that you are able to be here and that we can be together in this time of Bible studies to learn from the Word and be encouraged by the discussion of the truths in it. We're studying in the Gospel of Luke in this Sunday morning class, and we're in chapter 11. Luke chapter 11 is where we continue our discussion this morning. In Luke chapter 11, we pick up our reading at verse 33. Jesus said, No man, when he hath lighted a candle, putteth it in a secret place, neither under a bushel, but on a candlestick, that they which come in may see the light. The light of the body is the eye. Therefore, when thine eye is single, thy whole body also is full of light. But when thine eye is evil, thy body is also full of darkness. Take heed, therefore, that the light which is in thee be not darkness. If thy whole body, therefore, be full of light, having no part dark, the whole shall be full of light, as when the bright shining of a candle doth give thee light. Okay, I think we're familiar with this expression in verse 33. You don't light a candle and put it under a bushel, but on a candlestick. That's a familiar expression. It's found in the Sermon on the Mount. That's where it's more frequently referenced. This is a different episode. This is not Sermon on the Mount time. And so this is a separate incident when Jesus said basically the same thing. You know, our kids in Bible class sing about, you don't put your light under a bushel. And so very familiar expression. But this is a different incident where Jesus made that same expression. Now, I think we understand that. In other words, the observation is an obvious one. You don't light a candle, put it under a bushel. You put it on a candlestick, so it gives its light. Now, but in this particular context, Jesus is not so much emphasizing, as he does in Matthew 5, the idea of letting your light shine to the world. Here, he's using this expression to denote the idea of being personally illuminated, I think. Personally enlightened by the Word. And I believe that's what he goes on to explain. The light of the body is the eye. Now that maybe is a little bit difficult or confusing. The light of the body is the eye. But understand that this is symbolic kind of language or figurative kind of language. The light of the body is the eye. He's using the eye to denote what you see or perceive or understand or comprehend. In other words, I see Tom. I know Tom's here because I see him. So what the eye sees is, in a sense, what then I perceive. I think he's using the eye in the sense of what is recognized, what is comprehended, what is perceived. And so the light of the body is the eye. Therefore, when thine eye is single, thy whole body is full of light. When your perceptions are keyed on spiritual things, when your thoughts and your comprehensions are centered on God, then everything's good. The body is full of light. Everything works when we keep that focus. Maybe that's the term we would use. When we keep our focus on spiritual things, then everything is good. But he says, when thine eye is evil, thy whole body is full of darkness. In other words, if I don't focus, if I don't stay perceptive of essential spiritual things, then a whole lot of things in my life go wrong. So I think he's basically saying, you stay focused on, I believe the expression we would use is, you stay focused on God, everything will work out fine. But if you don't stay focused, if your perceptions and your comprehensions are compromised with the things of the world, then a whole lot of things can go wrong. And so he says, with that understanding, verse 35, take heed therefore that the light which is in thee be not darkness. In other words, this is important business. Be careful what you focus on. Be careful what your attentions are drawn to, what your eye is looking at. Keep your eye focused on spiritual things. If your whole body is full of light, having no part dark, the whole shall be full of light, as when the bright shining of a candle doth give thee light. I think we see this, and again, the expressions are maybe a little bit awkward to us, but I think we see this in people's lives. You know, if you think back in your remembrance of people who seem to really have people you've known, Christians you've known, brethren in the church that you've known, and their lives just seemed to work. Everything seemed to be good for them. They were just clicking. Now, that's not to say anybody's life is completely free of trials and tribulations. That's not saying. But if you've known, and I can think back of people I've known through the years, and I thought, man, they've got it all together. They've got it figured out. Their life is working. Well, those were the people who were really spiritually focused, who had that as their absolute primary objective and agenda. They weren't compromising. They weren't trying to, sort of compromise with the world. They were really focused on serving God, and it worked. Their lives worked. On the other hand, we've all known people who, sort of were trying to hold hands with God and the world at the same time, and their lives really got messed up as a result of that. And I believe that's the principle that Jesus is setting forth in this paragraph. Tom?
It sort of ties in is also teaching, no one can serve two masters.
Right.
Give heed to one and ignore the other, or vice versa, and sometimes not both. And a lot of things he's talking about is sort of a goal oriented type focus on that. When we open our eyes and see, our eyes take in a whole lot of things. But right at this point, my focus is sort of on you because I'm directing my thoughts to you.
Yes.
But if I see somebody out of my peripheral vision, catches my attention out there with something,
You're distracted.
I get distracted and turn away from it.
Uh-huh.
And we see that, when we take, examples, driving, for instance, you need to focus on what's out in front of you, but you need to be aware of the other things that are out there, but your true focus is,
this is why they made new rules about using your phone while you drive, or texting, especially while you drive. I saw a video, and this is a good while back, but this news reporter had cameras on his glasses. And so you were looking at what he was looking at as he's going down the road. And he's going down the road and he's texting. And you're thinking, look up, man, look at the road. He wasn't looking at the road at all. He was looking at his phone as he was texting, and that's totally distracted. And that's why they've tried to make new rules. Probably decent, good rules. Maybe maybe they've overstepped. But the point of it is, if you don't stay focused on what is most important, then you get this, as you said, Tom, distracted, and it causes problems. Tom?
If you're out hiking and you're on like a steep mountain thing with a very narrow path, you really have to watch where you're going. You could get distracted by the view and continue walking, and the path makes a turn, and you've got major drop. So it's there's a lot of obstacles in there, and that focus going on makes a big difference.
I think you're right. Other thoughts or comments, anybody? All right, like I said, I think the construction of that, at least in our English translation, is a little bit awkward, but I really believe that that's the idea. And I think if we were going to, in our modern kind of expression, if we were going to make the point that Jesus is making there, we'd say you got to stay focused on the things that are most important, and everything else will work out. But if you lose your focus, and if you begin to compromise and try to dwell on other things at the same time, it won't work out. All right, let's keep going then. Verse 37, and really this context runs all the way to the end of the chapter, but we may break it up here just a little bit. 37, as he spake, a certain Pharisee besought him to dine with him, and he went in and sat down to meat. And when the Pharisee saw it, he marveled that he had not first washed before dinner. And the Lord said unto him, Now do ye Pharisees make clean the outside of the cup and the platter, but your inward part is full of ravening and wickedness. Ye fools, did not he that made that which is without make that which is within also? Let's just stop there for a minute to comment on this washing of hands. This incident develops because he was invited to this man's house to dine with him, and he sat down without first having washed his hands. And the Pharisee was, the King James Version says, when he saw it, he marveled. I think we'd probably say something, he was flabbergasted. He sits down to eat without washing his hands. Because the reason for that, of course, is that this was a tradition that the Jews had established, and they were guilty of binding some of these traditions as law. In other words, this was not a violation of the law of Moses. Jesus never violated the law of Moses. But here he was stepping on their bound tradition. They had made this an obligation, and so it wasn't that the Pharisee observed it and thought, man, that guy would do well to wash his hands. This is just a matter of hygiene. He should wash his hands before he eats. No, that wasn't what he was complaining about. He was complaining about the fact that there was a bound Jewish tradition that involved washings of various kinds, and one of them was this washing of hands prior to eating anything. But this was not the law of God; it was the law of the Jews, but it was such a well-established tradition that it caused the Pharisee to be shocked that Jesus wouldn't observe it. Tom?
The American Standard rejects the word ceremonial washing his hands.
Yeah, okay.
Which sort of implies that maybe he did, but he didn't go through.
This wasn't just what we do when we wash our hands before we eat.
This was an act of show that that it's just like anything else that
Yeah, I think you're right. We often do, and probably should wash our hands before we eat. I mean, Cindy will often say before I handle food, "Have you washed your hands?" Well, yeah, it's a good thing to wash your hands. But this, as you say, was a religious act. This wasn't just a hygiene practice. And so Jesus uses that as a springboard to teach about some of the issues that these Pharisees themselves had. In verse 39, you Pharisees, now do you Pharisees make clean the outside of the cup and the platter, but your inward part is full of ravening and weakness. So he says the problem with the Pharisees was they were concerned with outward matters, but not inward ones. And so, they wanted to look good to others. On the outwardly, they wanted to put forth a very, righteous impression in people's minds. But Jesus knew, because he knew the hearts of men, right? Jesus knew that the Pharisees, the big problem of the Pharisees were they didn't pay attention to their inward, to their heart, to their attitudes, to their thinking, what was going on in their minds. And so that's what he's saying here. You clean the outside of the plate. Can you imagine that? So you go to eat at somebody's house. Imagine, and the table is all set and it's very pretty, and they got all nice china set out there. But when you get and sit down, you look inside your soup bowl, and it's obvious that the soup bowl hasn't been washed in several past uses, and it's just nasty, ugly, filthy inside. You couldn't, that would be, and that's the picture that Jesus is painting here with words. That he says that's what the Pharisees are like. They try to make this nice outward impression, but inwardly they are not. He goes on, ye fools, did not he that make that which is without make that which is within also? So that's a reference to the washing of hands challenge that had been addressed to him. But rather give alms of such things as ye have, and behold, all things are clean unto you. In other words, and he just uses almsgiving as a illustration of the principle. You got to have a good heart. You got to have a right kind of heart to give benevolent gifts. That's what alms were. The alms were benevolent gifts, and your heart needs to be right if you're going to be just benevolently generous to people who are honestly in need. And so Jesus is using that one thing. That's not the only thing, but that's one thing. In other words, if you've got the kind of heart that you can give alms, then you've probably got your act together spiritually. But if you're just interested in making an outward show, that's not going to get the job done. And he goes on, more illustrations of this same principle. But woe unto you Pharisees, for ye tithe mint and rue and all manner of herbs, and pass over judgment and the love of God. These ought ye to have done, and not to leave the other undone. I've always appreciated this, and Jesus makes the same point in Matthew's account of the same thing as in chapter 23 of Matthew. But so a lot of people, if you were to ask a lot of people, a lot of people would say the problem with the Pharisees was legalism. They were legalists. They demanded strict obedience to the law. And you, by the way, if you demand strict obedience to the law of God today, you're a legalist. In fact, you're a Pharisee. Have you ever been called a Pharisee? I imagine you probably have. I have been called a Pharisee. In other words, when you insist, this is what the New Testament teaches, and this is the way it must be done. Well, you're just being a Pharisee. And so a lot of people have this idea that the whole problem with the Pharisees was legalism, insisting on strict compliance with of course they were under the law of Moses, but they were trying to insist upon strict adherence to the law, and Jesus said, forget that. That's nuts. You shouldn't be so worried about keeping the law. That's wrong. Notice what Jesus said there in verse 42. Ye Pharisees tithe mint and rue and all manner of herbs. So we know the Old Testament law of tithing. And specifically when you brought in a harvest. Let's say you brought in 100 bushels of corn or wheat. Let's make it wheat. You brought in 100 bushels of wheat. The law required you to give 10 bushels to the Levites. So they had to pay a tithe, literally 10%. Well, 100 bushels of wheat, fine, I'll give my 10%. But what about herbs? I grow all the herbs that I need in a window box, just outside the bedroom window. And when I reap an annual harvest of these herbs, it's just literally just a handful. But the Pharisee said, that's still a crop. That's still a gain. You need to divide that up in 10 parts and give a tenth to the Lord. Oh man, that's extreme legalism. We're just talking about a handful of herbs. That's crazy. That's crazy legalism, people say. What did Jesus say? He said, you pay tithe of mint and rue and all manner of herbs and pass over judgment and the love of God. These ought ye to have done, that is, judgment and the love of God, and not to leave the other undone. Tithing your herbs, you shouldn't leave that undone. That's important. Do that. He's not saying, forget that. That's overly legalistic. It's unnecessary. You're straining at a gnat. He didn't say that. He says you ought to do that. But you also ought to engage yourself in judgment or justice and the love of God. So he wasn't saying that their problem was paying too much attention to minute details of the law. He didn't criticize them for that. What he criticized them for was leaving off the harder things, justice and the love of God. He said, you need to work on that. You got your tithing business down pat. Work on justice and the love of God. Tom?
It also ties into the same thing in other places. It says, unless your righteousness exceed that of the scribes and Pharisees, you're not going to do anything. So it's, there was things that they were doing that was righteous, but condemnation that what he exalts us to do is go beyond what they were doing.
Yeah.
Do the whole thing.
Yeah.
And he, in different ways of phrasing it, he's going through and making those same parallels. The same thing that he did with, talking to them about wanting better places in the synagogue, going out and calling the crowd together and giving alms so that, oh, look how great this guy is, or, or going in and standing up and making a show when they pray. All these things can, tie in and are all complementary to what Jesus is saying in this passage.
They were very much about outward show. And Jesus is saying your heart's not right. They were making a show, but their heart wasn't right. Okay. Verse 43, woe to you Pharisees, for you love the uppermost seats in the synagogues and the greetings in the market. Woe unto you scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites, for ye are as graves which appear not, and the men that walk over them are not aware of them. So first of all, again, verse 43, pretty obvious. You're just interested in what about your appearances. You want to be praised. You want to be honored. You want to have the uppermost seats. You want to be greeted as some really great religious person. Well, the problem with that is that was their priority. That was their motive. That's why they were doing what they were doing. That doesn't work. So if a righteous person is acknowledged, that's okay. But if what you're doing is in order to receive that acknowledgement, that's, in other words, what you're wanting is to be praised of men, then in Matthew chapter 6 in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said, when you get that praise of men, you've got your reward. That's what you wanted. That's what you were going for. And when you got it, you got what you're going to get. So they were very much that way. Jesus is very graphically condemning them here. What about verse 44? You scribes, Pharisees, and hypocrites, ye are as graves which appear not. Well, remember, under the law of Moses, there were prohibitions about coming into contact with dead bodies. Over in Matthew 23, Jesus refers to them as whited sepulchres. So we know that it was not common for them to dig a grave in the dirt like we do. They often would carve out a tomb in a solid rock wall, or often they used caves to bury their dead. But when they sealed up those tombs, they would whitewash them, not for beautification purposes necessarily, but as a sign, as a warning. Now sometimes you'd have to go in there because they would use such a sepulcher or tomb or a cave to bury more than one person. And so sometimes it'd be necessary to move the stone and carry in another dead body. When you did that, you were unclean. And so then you come out, you seal the tomb up, then you go through rites of purification under the law of Moses. So don't go in there unless you intend to go in there knowing that you'll be unclean when you come out. That was the principle. Well, Jesus said, you scribes and Pharisees, you're like an unmarked tomb. And the problem is, people don't know that in coming into contact with you, they're going to be polluted. They're going to be unclean because of they're unaware. In other words, you look like this whited sepulcher, but that's the presentation you want to give. But actually, you're like an unmarked tomb, and the people who come into contact with you are made unclean in the process. So that's what I'm going to tell you. That would be an extremely unacceptable kind of statement to be made to someone in our day and time. The description that Jesus gives there, you're like an unmarked grave, you're like a whited sepulcher. Man, if people taught at that level today, they would be widely criticized. I think even in the church, if we used that kind of graphic language in our day and time, it would raise eyebrows. But this is Jesus. You can't say it was wrong to use that kind of strong language. This is Jesus. What he is saying is obviously perfectly right when he described them in that way. Any thoughts or comments, Monty?
Make me think that we might be a little bit, maybe in our teaching practices, there's times that it's appropriate for us to be more firm or more graphic or more strong in the things we say, rather than, I think quite often, especially in our culture, we worry too much about hurt somebody's feelings, that I think the proper term today is offending somebody. I seen something today, and this college-age person was saying something about how they had the right to not be offended. Well, that's not a right to not be offended. What Jesus was saying here was offensive to these people, but it's what they needed to hear. He was trying to wake them up so they could examine themselves and see they were wrong. And sometimes we got to be pretty firm in what we say to wake people up and get them to examine themselves. And so I don't think we should be afraid of, and I'm not saying go out of our way to try to hurt anybody's feelings. I don't mean it that way, but I think we worry entirely too much about what we say, trying to teach people, or the way we try to do it, and not give enough emphasis on preaching truth. We tend to whitewash it. We tend to water it down because we don't hurt somebody's feelings. We need to be firm in what we say. If we believe what we say, if we believe the Bible and think what we're saying is the truth, we ought to be willing to be bold in our speech.
Okay, I think you're right. Yeah, Wayne.
We often look at the statements that Jesus made and forget the setting in which it was made. He was asked for lunch at one of the Pharisees' houses, but also apparently there was a gathering of scribes and Pharisees together as they would come and eat together. And Jesus came in among the crowd. And he doesn't mince any words with them. He's not concerned about their feelings, but he is concerned about their soul, about their spiritual condition. And so he sets aside the feeling to work on the spiritual condition.
Yeah.
And that's the same thing that I think we sometimes have the wrong motivation, might be okay, may not. We have the wrong emphasis. And I think that's in the context here. The wrong emphasis is worrying about the feelings of others and not caring about their soul.
I think you're right. You know, there's a very simple concept that, you know, we don't want to make people feel bad. Well, actually, when you do bad, you should feel bad. In other words, so if our teaching makes someone feel bad because they're doing bad, then that's what truth is supposed to do. You know, and if we try to avoid that outcome, then we're not going to get the message we're not getting the message to them that they need to hear. Jesus was getting the message to these people that they needed to hear. Did some of them feel bad after what Jesus said? Well, maybe they did. They probably should have. Because that principle, when you do bad, you should feel bad, is you know, in place. Tom?
The next few verses, you know, one of them stands up and tells him that. And then he goes through and he also rebukes him. Because he sort of separates himself from the scribes and Pharisees. He's a lawyer. Well, I know the law. Yeah. And Jesus goes through and, you know, tells it, puts him, you know, lets him know that, well, even in your doing the law, practicing the law, you're going beyond what it's saying. You're not practicing the spirit of the law.
Okay.
So, you know, they did get offended by it.
Yeah, they did. Yeah. So as Tom mentions, after hearing these sort of strong rebukes from Jesus, verse 45, then answered one of the lawyers and said to him, now understand, lawyer, you know, without fail, if you mentioned a lawyer today, we'd be talking about someone who's down on the courthouse square who takes, you know, so you've been arrested for something, you hire a lawyer, he goes before the judge, and it's about the law of the land. This lawyer is different. Of course, we know that the law of Moses was not only their religious law, but it was also their civil law. But this lawyer, the expression lawyer in the New Testament has to do with an expert in the law of Moses. That's the law under consideration. So one of the lawyers said to him, Master, thus saying, thou reproachest us also. Well, so he got the idea. Jesus is reproaching people. Jesus is condemning people. Jesus is showing the errors of people. Jesus has been addressing the scribes and Pharisees, and one of the lawyers says, you know, you paint with a pretty broad brush there, Jesus. You're catching us too. And so Jesus goes on. In verse 46, woe unto you also, ye lawyers! For ye laid men with burdens grievous to be borne, and ye yourselves touch not the burdens with one of your fingers. Woe unto you for, well, let's just take verse 46 first. So what about the lawyers? Well, okay, what about the lawyers? Well, the lawyers knew the law. They knew and they could tell, but you got to do this, and you got to do this, and you got to do this, and you better make sure you're doing it right, and here's the way to do it, and that's the way to do it. So Jesus said, you put these burdens on people. And in fact, you grievously burden people, probably. So I don't think he's saying that by teaching and instructing in the law of Moses that you are grievously burdening people. My guess is the reason why he would criticize the lawyers for grievously burdening people is because, go back to how this all started. You didn't wash your hands. You didn't ceremonially wash your hands. So you lawyers, you grievously burden people, not by teaching the law of Moses per se, but adding in all these other requirements that you have developed. But the truth of the matter is you don't do it yourself. And we would use the expression, you don't practice what you preach. You tell people all this stuff they got to be doing. You're not doing it yourself. And so, of course, that's extremely, I think for all of us, that's just an extremely distasteful quality in a person, to be holding others up to a standard that they won't live to themselves. Jesus said that's what the lawyers were doing. John?
When you go back to 2 Corinthians chapter 7, he's talking about how he wrote a letter to them telling them what they were doing wrong. And he says, even though I grieve you to repentance, meaning that, he may have hurt their feelings, but it wasn't for the purposes of just hurting their feelings. He was making them think about what they did, make them
Exactly.
regret what they did.
I think you're exactly right. In other words, he acknowledged that what he said made them feel bad, but he wasn't sorry for it because it led them to repentance. Exactly right. All right. So Jesus continues his address toward this lawyer. Woe unto you, for ye build the sepulchres of the prophets, and your fathers killed them. Truly ye bear witness that you allow the deeds of your fathers, for they indeed killed them, and ye build their sepulchres. Therefore also said the wisdom of God, I will send them prophets and apostles, and some of them they shall slay and persecute, that the blood of all the prophets which was shed from the foundation of the world may be required of this generation, from the blood of Abel unto the blood of Zacharias, which perished between the altar and the temple. Verily I say unto you, it shall be required of this generation. All right. So I think this is kind of interesting. Now, we know that there's a principle that the sons are not accountable for the sins of their fathers, and the fathers are not accountable for the sins of their sons. Ezekiel 18 teaches that plainly. But this is a little different. He says, you build the sepulchres of the prophets that your fathers killed, and you bear witness that you allow the deeds of your fathers, for they indeed killed them and you build their sepulchres. In other words, he's saying you all have basically signed off on the unrighteous deeds of your fathers. When they persecuted and killed God's righteous prophets, you basically sign off and acknowledge that you're okay with that by virtue of now you build the sepulchres of the prophets. Like you're going to honor them when your fathers killed them. And he says you're complicit in that whole attitude toward the prophets of God. Monty?
New King James uses the word approve instead of allow. There's another passage in the New Testament that talks about not only those who do the sin, but those who take pleasure. And in some translations, they're used the word approve there. So it's the concept is they're not answering. These people weren't going to answer for the deeds of their fathers. They were going to answer for the fact that they approved of it. They participated,
right,
so to speak, in it. They gave their amen to it. And so that's what we have to take the same thing. I'm not going to answer for the deeds of my father, but if I participate in the same things or show my approval for what he did, then I'm just as guilty as he was.
I think that's exactly right. Exactly right. All right. So he mentions two prophets, Abel and Zacharias. Well, we know Abel, right? In fact, on Wednesday night, we just recently studied about Cain and Abel. Abel was the first man of God who was killed or martyred because of his righteous service to God, right? I think that's why Jesus picks him out. Abel was the very first in the Old Testament, the very first one to be killed because he had done the will of God, right? Cain killed Abel because Cain didn't do what God said and Abel did. It enraged Cain and he killed his brother Abel. So Abel was the first man of God to be killed for doing the will of God. I think it's interesting that he chose then Zacharias, and this Zacharias is not a well-known Old Testament individual. He was, I think you can prove me on this. he was the last prophet, the last martyred prophet mentioned in the Old Testament. His account is in 2 Chronicles 24, verses 20 through 21. This is in the context, you remember when Joash was king, and the priest sort of Joash became, he was one of the boy kings of Judah, and he became king when he was just a child, and the priest Jehoiada mentored him through his life. And Joash did really well until Jehoiada died, and when Jehoiada died, then other people actually succeeded in corrupting Joash at the end of his life. And this Zacharias was the son of Jehoiada, and he was killed because he was pointing out the abuses, and he was trying to hold the line of faithfulness to God, and they killed him. I believe that he's the last one in the Old Testament. I may be wrong about that, but he's certainly one of the latter ones, but I think the last one. Not necessarily he was the last one who ever died, the last prophet who ever died, but he was the last one who was specifically martyred that's mentioned. I think that's right. And so he mentions Abel and Zacharias. But he says all the blood of the prophets which was shed from the foundation of the world be required of this generation, because you're going right along with the same attitudes and actions that prompted people to kill the prophets of old. And here you are acting like you honor them, but in fact the matter is that you are proving the way that they had been treated. Thoughts or comments on any of that? All right. Again, it shall be, the blood of those prophets shall be required of this generation. Not that we inherit the sins of our forefathers, but as Monty pointed out a minute ago, the reason why why their blood was going to be, they're going to be accounted for the blood of prophets, not because they did the deed or were guilty by inheritance of having done the deed. Their guilt was in approving the deed, acknowledging and accepting that without condemnation. Okay. Verse 52, he's still talking to the lawyers. Woe to you lawyers, for you have taken away the key of knowledge. Ye entered not in yourselves, and them that were entering in ye hindered. So lawyers are supposed to know the law. They're supposed to know it well. They've got it figured out. They can teach it to other people. But he says these lawyers have taken away the key of knowledge. In other words, you have not allowed people to pursue the knowledge of the law. You knew it and you didn't take advantage of it. You knew it and you didn't enter in. And the fact of the matter is, those who were trying to enter in, you hindered them by the way you are acting. So he condemns them. You know, several times in this context, the word woe is found, at least in the King James rendering. I think probably in the others as well. You know, and that's a strong word. That's nothing to be considered lightly. A woe on someone is a very bad expression. And so he's using powerful words. Woe to you lawyers. Any thoughts or comments here? Anybody? Monty.
The word woe, he's using that. We might maybe identify with saying cursed or something, really profound. Like cursed to eternal punishment you're going to be for this. So he's, like you said, he's not being mild with them here. Yeah. He's not trying to spare their feelings or keep from offending them. He's really trying hard to get their attention. He's using really what to them would have been really harsh language in order to get that attention.
Right. Tom?
We're going back to the prophets and things. One of the things that Jesus is trying to teach them is you never listen to the prophets. Here you want to build monuments to them to remember them as men, but you don't want to remember what they were telling you to do, what God through them was telling you to do. So you try to honor them, but you don't really honor the purpose that they were here for. And I think that's what Jesus is trying to bring forward to it. Your fathers never paid attention to them; they killed them. You're here building monuments to them, recognizing those great men, but you're not remembering what they taught and what God taught through them. And so you're not really honoring them; you're dishonoring them in building those monuments.
I think you're right. You know, it would be like today, where I don't want to get too political here, but you imagine someone who has a very liberal political agenda, and yet they want to build a monument to Ronald Reagan, who was very conservative. That doesn't make sense, you know. So he's saying there's an inconsistency here. You're building monuments, as you said, to the prophets. You're honoring, you're building their sepulchres, but you're not in line with what they taught or did at all. And so that is the inconsistency. The chapter ends, verse 53. And as he said these things unto them, the scribes and Pharisees began to urge him vehemently and to provoke him to speak of many things, laying wait for him and seeking to catch something out of his mouth that they might accuse him. I think that deserves, a little bit of time to meditate upon what Jesus was faced with. And so recognize that these are the most powerful people of the Jews. The scribes, the Pharisees, and the lawyers represented the elite ruling class of the Jews. And Jesus has enraged them. And so now they're going to work harder than ever to try to find something that they can entrap him with. They're going to be working overtime to find something whereby they can accuse Jesus. How would you like that? How would you like to have every word you say analyzed and parsed and challenged? Do you ever say anything that could be taken the wrong way? Or maybe even, do you ever misspeak from time to time? We all do that, right? Wouldn't it be awful that if you were in an environment where every single word that came out of your mouth was going to be strictly analyzed, and if you said anything that was just a fraction off, people are going to pounce on that and use that to criticize you? We don't want to live like that, right? But the fact of the matter is, that's what Jesus lived with all through especially the last part of his life. He had these very powerful Jews, the religious elites of the day, and they were analyzing every word and action of Jesus under a magnifying glass. They were combing through it with a fine-tooth comb, as we say. They were just looking for any little scrap or shred that they could use to criticize him. What's amazing is that when we get to the end of Jesus' life, and they're trying to find someone, they're trying to call up witnesses to accuse him in his trial. Remember, we recently studied about it. They couldn't come up with anything. For a good while, they had him under a magnifying glass. They were looking at everything he said as closely as they possibly could. They never came up with anything. And in his trial, they could not come, although they'd been looking, and they'd been looking hard and been looking for a long time, they could not come up with any sustainable accusation. That speaks to the perfection of Jesus and his sinlessness. Because if they could have, they would have produced his misstatements. He didn't say anything wrong. All right, that's a good place to break, and we're just out of time. Monty?
We quite often run into it. In this context, Jesus is telling some people, you're not living right. And then, so then they attack him here. They're taking these words to them. And people do us that way today. We have to go sometimes and tell somebody, hey, what you're doing, it's not right, you're not living right. Well, then they want to attack our character and tell them, well, you're not doing this or you're doing that or whatnot. So really, we're getting the same abuse, so to speak, as Jesus got when we try to do what he did, which is correct people's bad behavior.
Yeah. And we got to be willing to take that. I mean, Jesus took it. I mean, and we've got to be willing to take it. Certainly, we're not anywhere close to the level of what Jesus encountered, but he endured those kind of unrighteous criticisms, and we'll have to too. All right, thanks everybody.